So the heart of the gospel is God's heart and his motive of why he gave his son's life for you. So we began to study last week how Jesus called his disciples, what he called them to, and also how he called them. And we saw that Jesus is also calling us on a journey, and that's so that we will fulfill his purpose for this church and how he will fulfill. Therefore, to do that, he has to fulfill his purpose for your life. In fact, last week I read what I believe was a prophetic word that God gave over this church, and it's in the notes for last week if you want to download. They're still up there. And so today we're going to continue looking at that, and we're going to begin to look at exactly what Jesus called them to do. And this is so important because many of us have been around for a while, have our own ideas and have our own teachings and own things we like to follow, and we miss the simplicity of this. And so it's very important. That's why I'm going to take some time and go through this, because this is so simple, we miss it all the time. What we're going to learn, and I've already told you what it is, we all know it, but we're not doing it. Why? Because we don't really know it. We haven't really heard the Master's call personally to us. So we're going to go over some of the same things over and over again. And if you think, well, I got that, that's a sure sign you don't have it yet. Because when you get it, you want to hear it more because you don't have all of Jesus. You don't have all of Jesus yet. I mean, he's in you, but you don't know all of him yet. The Bible talks about the unsearchable riches of Christ. So if you think you know him as best you can, you haven't touched the surface, because there's always much more of him to know. And the statement came to me a few weeks ago, and I've said it several times. Just a question to ask yourself. Don't raise your hand. But if you look at your own life, can you say, I know Jesus personally better this year than I did a year before? If not, we need to grow together, because he wants to reveal himself to you and then through this church. So that's the journey that we're on together. And so we're going to begin today to look exactly what he called them to do and how he called them. So in John chapter 1, we're going to look at today at there are 4 stories in the Gospels about Jesus calling his disciples. And we're going to look at 3 of them. I mentioned one of them last week, and it's not in my notes. I may mention it again. But to go to the one the one that's in John chapter 1 is a little different than the other 3, and I'll mention that and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But to do this, I want to give you a little bit of background here to understand, because we talk about following a shepherd, following someone. Back in the days that we're looking in the New Testament, it was very common for them to be Jewish rabbis. There were many Jewish rabbis that had risen up, and a rabbi is just a Hebrew word for teacher. He was a teacher. But they didn't just teach in a school. They would have men, because the women didn't go to the teachings, that would follow their teaching. And they would begin to develop an interest in this particular rabbi's focus, because many of them had a focus or an interpretation of the Scriptures. The point is that in the time of Jesus' walking on this earth in his public ministry, there were many rabbis out there, and they had followers who were adherents to their particular view of the Scriptures. And in many cases, they would follow them around and listen to their teaching, and they were very devoted to them. So with that background, we're going to pick up and we're going to look at John the Baptist, because he had followers like this. And they were called disciples. Because we hear the term disciple, and we didn't immediately think of the 12 that Jesus called. But disciple just means a teacher, a student, one that's following the teaching of another and is dedicated to that teaching. It comes from a Latin word that basically means a disciplined one, but one who follows the discipline of another. And so I wanted that background, because you're going to see references to disciples. Oh, are those the ones that follow Jesus? No, we'll see the ones that follow Jesus. So John chapter 1, I'm not there yet. John chapter 1, we're going to pick up at verse 35. This is John the Baptist. He's been baptizing by the river Jordan. And again the next day, John the Baptist, stood with two of his disciples, his adherents, those that followed him, and looking at Jesus as he walked by, we talked about this a few weeks ago, John says, "Behold the Lamb of God." Clearly referring to the Passover lamb, clearly referring to Messiah. The two disciples heard John speak, and they followed Jesus. Notice Jesus didn't invite them. They're curious about this one that John the Baptist, their rabbi, has just said, this is the Lamb of God. Verse 38, then Jesus turned and seeing them following, said, "What do you seek?" That's an important question. And they said to him, "Rabbi," which is translated teacher. So all they see him right now as is a teacher, just like John was a teacher, just like others were a teacher. And they asked, "Where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." And they came and saw where he was staying. Now, there's nothing spiritual happening here. They're just coming out of curiosity. And to remain with him that day, it was about the 10th hour, which means in Jewish terms, it was about 4 o'clock. And one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. That's going to become important to us in a few minutes. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. So now Andrew, Peter's brother, is now recognizing this man may well be the Messiah, and somewhere in here he goes to tell his brother, Andrew, Peter, who may well have been among this larger group. Verse 42, and he brought him to Jesus. Boy, would that preach. And when Jesus looked at him, that's at Peter, he said to you, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which translates a stone, and in English means Peter. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip. And he said to him, "Follow me." Now, out of all of these, this is the first one that Jesus says, "You follow me." Andrew's trying to follow Peter, but Peter tried to follow Jesus, but Jesus hasn't asked him to follow him yet. We're going to see next week how important this is, because there's some people that try to follow Jesus out of their own initiative, and it doesn't work. We'll deal with that later on. Okay. And now he says to Philip, "Follow me." And Philip was from Bethsaida, the city which Andrew and Peter were from. And Philip goes and finds Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses says in the law and the prophets wrote, it's Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael says to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" And Philip says to him, "Just come and see." And Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said, "Behold, an Israelite in whom there is no deceit or guile." And Nathanael says to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, you were under the fig tree and I saw you." That's an operation of one of the gifts of the Spirit. I saw you. Now, Nathanael is beginning to realize there's something unusual about this man, because there's a supernatural aspect to him, because he's seeing him before he was physically in front of him. And Nathanael answered, verse 49, and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Now this is important, because let's go now to Matthew chapter 4. We read this last week. This was an account of how Jesus calls them. But what we're going to see is they obviously had some experience with him. This is not their first encounter with him. Matthew chapter 4, verse 18. And Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee. So this first scene in John's not in Galilee, because we read where he said, "I'm going to go up to Galilee." Walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And we talked about this last week. And now he says to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And the whole series that we're in right now, the title of the series is "Follow Me." And that's what we are called to do. That's all we're called to do, but out of that calling comes many different things that we're responsible to do. And this is why it's important to look at this. Follow me. And they immediately left their nets and followed him. Verse 21, and going on from there, they saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and immediately they left their boats and their father, and they followed him. So this is, again, Peter and Andrew and John, who may have already had contact with him, we saw in John chapter 1. And notice when Jesus calls them, it's the exact same invitation that he gave to Philip. Follow me. Now let's go to one other account, and that's over in Luke chapter 5. While you're turning there, I want to remind you that we looked at this last week in Mark, and that's also in Matthew 2. There's another disciple that's called, and that's Matthew, although he's Levi at the time, and he is a tax collector. He's not a fisherman. He's not an apostle. He's a tax collector. He works for the Roman government, but he's a Jew, and he's an IRS agent. But why he was so hated is, first of all, he was hated by the Jews because he was working for the Roman government that was oppressing him. So he represented the Roman government to them, and he represented the Roman government getting in their pockets, taking their money. But even worse than that, their income was whatever they could collect from the Jewish brothers in addition to what Rome required. So they were authorized to use their authority to collect whatever they could get out of the Jews, and whatever was above and beyond what the Rome required, they could keep as their commission. And so as a result, the Jews hated them not just for serving the Roman government, but for taking money out of their pockets and using their Roman authority to do that. And Jesus goes to one of them, Levi, and he just goes up to him and says, you, follow me. And it says Levi got up and left the money, he left everything, and followed Jesus. So we're looking at why. Why would that happen? Why would somebody do that? Well, we're going to get a little more insight in here into Luke chapter 5. Verse 1. So it was that as the multitude pressed about him, Jesus, to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, that's up in Galilee. And he saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's. This is the same Simon we just read about. And he asked him to put it out a little bit from the land, and he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. Now, why is he doing this? This is not important for the message, but I believe there's two reasons. It separates him from the people so that he can actually get the teaching. He now has a chance to sit down, but also, more importantly, they didn't have microphones and PA systems, and he's got a huge multitude following him. So what Jesus would do is go out on the water, because if living around here, if you get on the water very easily or near the water amplifies sound. It travels over it very quickly. In fact, a number of years ago, we had a boat. My son and I had a boat together, and we had to be careful because you could hear other people talking about you on the boat. So that's an old-looking boat or whatever it was. And I realized people can hear us if we're talking about them. So Jesus is doing this to amplify. So he's using Peter's boat in order to help him preach a message. All right. Verse 4. And when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let your nets down for a catch. Now it's the daytime. Simon answered and said to him, Master. Now, in John, when he met him, he called him Rabbi, teacher. Now his revelation of who this man is growing a little more, and is acknowledging him to have some kind of authority, and he's calling him Master. So the revelation of who this Jesus of Nazareth is growing in Peter. And now Peter's got a choice, because we're going to see, because I'm not a fisherman, but from what I understand, fishermen like to fish at night, because that's when, see, if you're going to be a fisherman, you want to fish where the fish are and when the fish are there. Because if you just want to throw your line out there and have fun, you can do that any time of the day. But if you're serious about catching fish, the point here is Peter and his fishing company have already been out there. They fished all night because that's when the fish would be there. These are professional fishermen. They make their living knowing where the fish are and when the fish are there. And here is a carpenter. Look what he's going to tell them to do. Telling them to go out there and throw in their nets to catch fish. So here is a professional man using his professional training and reasoning to answer back to the God that created the fish and the water that they're in and the air they're breathing and the ground they're stepping on. This is the God who created all these things. And Peter, with his reasoning and with his experiencing, is answering him. But watch where this goes. Simon answered, verse 5, it says, Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Stop there. Peter's saying, not only am I a professional fisherman, and I know there's no fish out there because they don't come out this time of day, but I know it by experience. We were just there. There are no fish there. This is important. Because when God calls you, he'll tell you some things to do. And they'll often look impossible. They may not make sense. But who are you going to trust? Peter expresses all these concerns. We caught nothing. But look at this. Nevertheless, despite what I know by my experience, despite what I know by my physical senses, despite what I know by my professional training, nevertheless, at your word, I will go let my net down. I will put aside my training. I will put aside my pride because I'm a fisherman and I know what fish are and you're just a carpenter. I'll put that aside. I'll put aside what my own eyes have seen. There are no fish there. I'll put us aside at your word. I will choose to obey your word over what I know, over what my senses, over my profession, my background, over everything in my life. I will set that aside to obey your word. Watch what happens when he does that. Verse 6, and when they had done this, so they acted on the word, they caught a great number of fish and their net were breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. It's amazing when you obey the Lord what he can do for you. They worked all night in their own strength, in their own wisdom, in their own reasoning. They worked all night and caught nothing. Many of us have worked so hard to make something of ourselves and accomplish nothing. Simply by obeying his word, he filled their boats to the point of sinking. Bring all the tithes into the storehouse and see if I will not open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing on you that you cannot contain. That's not in my notes. So when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. In John's account, when they first encountered Jesus, he was a rabbi. When Peter's heard Jesus speak, or seen him now, he calls him master. And now, by taking Jesus at his word, he has a greater revelation of who Jesus is, and he calls him Lord. Out of that greater revelation, Peter sees himself as a sinful man, and now he sees Jesus as Lord. So it's not as simple as just Matthew's account. So how do these look like they contradict each other? No, they don't. John's account is a preliminary meeting where they had some knowledge. They've seen this man. They saw him, whether he was there when he called Nathanael or not, we don't know. But they saw him with the crowd. Heard John the Baptist say, this is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. They heard all this preliminary, and now Jesus comes to them to call them. And Jesus leads Peter through this miracle. And as a result of, what I want you to see, it's Peter's obedience to his word that opens the door to a greater revelation of who Jesus is. I'm going to make this statement down the road, and you don't need to understand it now, but I'm going to make the statement down the road. It does not originate with me. Is that faith comes from obedience, and obedience comes from faith. You cannot separate the two. Peter's faith in who he is came as a result of obedience to his word. Simply go do what doesn't make sense to you to do. Just do it because I said to do it. And out of his obedience to what Jesus said, Peter saw him as Lord and saw himself for who he was. Okay, now what I want to begin to do is talk about this call. We're going to break it down into several words. We're going to talk this morning about the word follow, just the word follow. Because what I want you to get, what God's dealing with me, what's critical in order for us to follow him is that we understand this point of how very simple this is. It's so simple we miss it. It's so simple we step over it. It's so simple we read through it. It's so simple we ignore it. It's so simple because we understand what follow means, but do we? Because we talked last week about when you really hits you, like when Jesus called Paul. We talked about that last week on the road to Damascus. When he called Paul, when Paul saw who he was, heard who he was, Paul's first words were, "What must I do?" And when we hear the word follow, when we hear these things and we sit and listen to them and say, boy, that's good, or then we've not yet really heard it, because when we really hear it, our response is, now what do I do? Not what do I have to do? Because following him is not something you have to do. Following is something you're privileged and graced to do because it's by invitation only. We'll talk about that down the road. The good news is you're all invited. Okay? All right. So we're going to talk about the simplicity of the call, the simplicity of it. And each of these accounts that we've read or talked about have this in common. He's called them to follow me, him. So let's talk about the simplicity of the call. Because what we like to do is we like to complicate things. For several reasons. First of all, that's too good. It can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. There's got to be more involved than that. Because the more involved in it is what I got to contribute. I got to do something here. I can't just follow. But that's pride. We want to understand where we're going. But you see, when we complicate it, that becomes an excuse to not do it. Because I got to understand exactly what you're saying to me before I can follow. I'm talking to me this morning. You can listen in. We like to, and boy, with my mind, I can complicate things just like that. Just ask my wife. I mean, I can take the simplest task and I can make it so complicated. It takes 14 years to even figure out how to start it. And while we're figuring it all out, I don't have to do it. So either you're feeling sorry for me or I'm not the only one. So Jesus makes it so simple, anybody could understand it. And the more educated you are, the harder it is to understand it, because I can't just follow him. We complicate things. And when we complicate it, we put barriers in people's ways of follow. Just follow me is all he said. But we need a program to do this. We need special lights, and we need special equipment, and we need all this. We need a cafe. These are all good things, but we don't need these things to follow him, and they can become a distraction. And some of them already have here, but they won't continue to be. We want to add to it. We want to complicate it. Our minds like to make things complicated so we can have our ideas, and we get, and even if it's not our own motive, we're dumb sheep. I didn't say that, Jesus said it. Dumb doesn't mean you're not smart. Dumb means they don't talk. But they're dumb. The sheep will follow whatever's in front of them to eat. Molly's like that. That's our little puppy. Molly's she's about that big now, tall. And she goes around with her nose, and we take her a walk, and she's always this, always this. Her nose is following whatever she smells. And she looks now, because her fur's grown back out again. She looks like a little sheep. And and sheep just follow wherever the food is. That's why they need a shepherd. And need to know the shepherd's voice. So because of that, they get distracted easily. They wander off and get distracted easily. Jesus talks about going to get the one sheep out of the 100 that wandered off and left the 99. See, that sheep wandered off. So he went to get it. Isn't that good news? Because he's a shepherd, and the shepherd loved their sheep and lay their life down for the sheep. We get distracted by issues that we or others think are important. So many issues out there today. And it's not just out there that are wrong. There are just so many things, even though they may be good things, that distract us from what we're called to do, which is simply follow Him.